there's been so much talk about demand gen versus demand creation. And some marketers are saying we should be very much revenue focused. And then on the other side, you start to see, certainly the last couple of years, folks just really talking about doing things that maybe are not as attributable to and map to kind of like the traditional kind of way we've thought about things from reporting and analytics and these sort of things. What's your take on kind of the idea that we should be operating more as B2C brands?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. I guess I'd start by saying I don't really think it's like an either or choice between being revenue focused and like worrying about things like brand. Right. I think it's actually just a reframing about how we think about marketing's role in revenue, and that, real sustainable long-term revenue growth, comes more from deeply understanding your market, building authentic customer relationships, and having things like strong product market fit, good positioning and differentiation, big, strong brand reputation and awareness. Those things ultimately all matter more than running a campaign to generate some MQLs. So I think ultimately, that's really what we need to be talking about, and, recognize that buying has changed. Buyers typically know the products and they know their first choice products before they even ever contact sales. And if we're not thinking about marketing to them in that way, in the right way, then we're falling behind. So it does require, so again, it's not an either or, but I think it does require some changes, right? It does require probably investing more in less measurable things than we have, more focus on the CMO on, what is our brand positioning and our reputation, not just how many MQLs did we create. And that ultimately is going to also require changes in how we measure marketing.
So how do we convince a board, or let's say you're that CMO who's really bought in and understands this new sort of motion or this new mix that has to exist today? How do you convince that CEO? How do you convince that board? I know you've talked a lot about the idea of how to educate, entertain, and elevate, right? And that entertain component, that hasn't really been something that I've seen over the last 15 years or so in B2B. We've seen it in B2C. So how do you actually have that conversation?
Yeah. Well, it's not, I don't want to say any of this is easy. We've spent 20 years almost educating CEOs and CFOs and private equity investors and boards, that marketing generates MQLs, and that you can almost think of marketing like a gumball machine where you put budget in and get MQLs out, right? And so it has to, I think, start with, sharing some of the data about how the old playbook is breaking. And you can look at things like declining SDR productivity, rising customer acquisition costs, decreasing pipeline generation effectiveness. And then also, you can share both the data about how buyers buy. Like I just referred to the 6 Sense buyer study that has that. Trust Radius has some studies on this. But you can also ask them as an executive, when you buy, right, how are you thinking about it? And like kind of, kind of get them there. So it starts with kind of having that kind of Socratic discussion around what's different. And then you want to say, okay, if we agree that it's different, then what needs to change in how we market and how we measure our marketing? And that can include literally just the language that we talk about, right? CEOs don't really like to talk about what's our positioning, right? That feels marketing squishy. They love to talk about the competition, right? And where we fit in with the competition. They don't really like talking about brand, but they are open to talking about what's our reputation, How do customers think about us? Look, here's data that shows how customers think about us. So I think there's some interesting ways you can kind of, think about that. So, it's a conversation more than anything else. There are some marketing executives out there who are renaming their title. So, taking the CMO title and saying that stands for the Chief Market Officer, not the Chief Marketing Officer. And it's really meant to represent that marketing is pretty much the only CXO function that's named after the tactical act of doing the job, as opposed to the outcome, right? It's not the chief selling officer. It's not the chief financing officer. And so I don't ultimately have an opinion on, if CMO should change their title, but bringing, the discussion about the title change to the forefront can be a impetus to have the discussion around the changing role of the function and buyers.
And how can marketers, CEOs, CROs out there who are thinking about go-to-market holistically kind of, I don't know if it's making a shift from demand generation as we've understood it to demand creation and it being, to your point, one or the other, but how do we start to embrace this idea that we have to create demand and the distinctions between the old paradigm and maybe the new paradigm that is more of an expansion and not again one or the other?
Well, I think a lot of it will start with different metrics. If you're only measuring marketing on MQLs, you're going to keep driving marketing to run campaigns that try to get, somebody's score above some threshold so you can call it an MQL. And ultimately, I don't think that kind of, incessant campaigning to people builds relationships. So I think if you can agree that, what we're trying to do is change how people think and feel about us before they are looking to buy, and you put some metrics in place that start to really measure, that, I think everything else sort of starts to fall out of it.
I love what you were speaking to in terms of the language, like reframing. It's almost like the idea of being able to manage up or sideways or I guess depending on where you sit within the organization. And it's not necessarily changing the strategy or adding something new, but it's reframing it so the stakeholder that you're speaking to will actually understand how it impacts the organization and something that will resonate with them.
Yep.
Awesome. Now,
But by the way, that's what marketers do, right? We speak to people in language they use, not the language we use. Just apply it internally as well.
I love that. Collaboration, alignment, right? We talk a little bit about that a little later, but I wanted to double click on the idea of AI, right? Like we've been now, the last 3 years ish, since OpenAI has really kind of exploded and all the other, similar technologies. What do you think, based on your experience, based on your vision, just given, and for the folks out there, Jon has literally created the modern marketing tech or MarTech stack here, right? Marketo out there, obviously everyone that watches this show should know that. From your vision or experience and sort of the way you've seen these technologies evolve over the years, what do you think the impact of AI is right now, and what do you think it's gonna, or how do you think it's gonna impact the MarTech function, the I should say the marketing function and the MarTech stack moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be pretty profound. I think that we are already seeing AI change some of the buying behaviors, and how and ultimately how we can reach customers. It's for years now, AI in our Gmail has been putting emails in the promotion tab. Right. And now we're starting to see AI summarize our inbox for us, if we want, and only surfacing up the things that we really need to know. We're also seeing it happen in search, where you can get the answer without, clicking to the website, which is known as kind of zero-click search. What I think we're going to start seeing over the next few years is the continuation of that disintermediation from AI, with the ultimate end state being AI buying agents.
Mm.
And an AI buying agent, can go out and research vendors and compare them against our requirements. They can even start to have, they'll also be selling agents, on who can, answer questions and share information, even conduct early pricing, information. So this all is in some ways the extension of the existing trend we've seen towards providing self-service buying opportunities. But ultimately, as marketers, what we need to get our heads around is that this trend of AI disintermediating and summarizing our marketing is only going to get worse.
Mm.
So how do you respond? In that world, you have to respond in a way by focusing on the things that AI cannot summarize.
Mm.
And I think that comes down to a couple things. It comes down to experiences, relationships, and then original research and information. So like on the experiences side, whether that's an event or a workshop or, a B2C style, brand experience, we're going to see more of this kind of marketing, because it's human.
Mm.
Chris Penn has the analogy, seeing the photo of somebody going to Disneyland is not the same as going to Disneyland, and that's exactly why AI can't summarize it. On the relationship side, in many ways, because AI can summarize things and can create information, the source of the information will begin to matter as much or more as the substance, because people will find the trusted sources and whitelist them, right? Frankly, we're already seeing this in like the news where we live in our different news bubbles. I think we'll start to see that happening even in our kind of, buying bubbles, if you will. That's partly why influencers are important and will continue to be, more important.
Are we saying then that our humanity is more important than ever before? It's funny because as you articulate these ideas, I can't seem to not think of this post I saw on Instagram the other day, which was the promotion of a non-tech cafe in Amsterdam, right? And so they literally have no Wi-Fi. You're not allowed to bring your phones in, or I think maybe you have to drop it off at the front, and you have to engage in human stuff. And what was, in that one-to-one sort of relationship building and community building. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is something we've been doing for, thousands of years. Technology has hit our lives maybe the last couple decades in such a meaningful way that now we are going back to those fundamentals. Is this what we're saying? So like dinners and even this podcast it can be edited by AI, but this conversation is real. I guess maybe there's some AI avatars that might do some of this at some point, but is this what we're saying?
Yeah. And I think this goes hand in hand what we talked about at the top of the show, right? Like, it's marketing is about building brand. It's about building relationships, and these things matter more than, turning the MQL crank. And AI is both making that even more important than ever, but it's also freeing us up to focus on those things more, right? As there's going to be a whole new generation of AI native marketing platforms, that can orchestrate cross-channel experiences and automatically build campaigns for you, based on briefs. We're going to be in a world where you're going to be able to just tell the system what you want, and it's going to figure out how to achieve those goals for you. That's going to be pretty amazing, because the more, to use what I talked about earlier, the more AI can focus on the ING of marketing, the tactical execution of doing the marketing, the more as humans we can focus on the market, which is really understanding the customers, building authentic relationships, generating experiences that can't be summarized, and that's, as Yusuf said, these aren't new principles. They're just principles we lost behind the years of automation. So yeah, it is ironic. In some ways, the rise of AI is making a world where the human marketing matters even more.
I love that. it reminds me of a conversation I had with Mark Roberts, from HubSpot. It's a good friend, and we were chatting a couple months ago about a conversation he had with the audience at one of the SaaSters, I think, like 2 years ago or whatnot. And he was telling me that he believed, and there's a lot of discussion over at HBS where he teaches and stuff about what's going to happen. Of course, everyone's speculating, but he says, dude, I think that there is a post work world that we've never seen before once AI gets going. This is perhaps a bit science fiction, but it was an interesting thought exercise to dig into. And what he was saying was that it's a bit scary to think that our paradigm is going to get blown up and change so much that we won't be working in the same way that we have been maybe the last couple hundred years or more. And so I noticed it within myself. I was like, oh, well, what the hell am I going to do then? And one of the things that he said was, maybe this opens us up to spend more time with our family, right? To spend more time on spiritual practices, for example, and these sort of things. So there's an entire paradigm. And again, for me, this feels like going back to our humanity, going back to some of those fundamentals.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think some people might use it to spend more time, not working, but I actually think the number of hours that people work is largely driven by the culture, right? Americans work more hours a week than some Europeans do, for example. So I think my hunch is it's fewer work hours, and it's more those work hours are going to be spent on different things.
Well, let's switch gears quickly into one of our favorite topics within go-to-market. And certainly over the last 20 years that I've been in SaaS, I've heard this over and over again, and I haven't seen a great solution. And it is the alignment between sales and marketing teams, right? And we just constantly hear and see this conflict. Some of the last companies that I've been part of, again, it's like I'm sitting there going, gosh, how can't we get this going and figure this out? Is this a human condition? Not to get too esoteric, is this like the software that we've just been working out of just causes some sort of misalignment because data sets are in different places or whatnot? Is this an incentives misalignment issue? What's your take? Because I know you as a CEO, but also as a CMO, you have a unique perspective on that.
Yeah, I once wrote a blog that I had titled "Sales is from Mars and Marketing is from Venus." And what I was really trying to get at is that we care about the same outcomes, right? But we think differently. We use different language sometimes to describe the same thing. And I think really importantly here, we operate on different timelines.
Mm.
Sales, I think naturally and rightly tends to focus mostly on this quarter, maybe looking 1 quarter ahead or so on pipeline. Whereas marketing, for all the reasons we've talked about on the show so far, needs to be thinking 12 to 18 months ahead to be building brand awareness and preference. And that inherently is going to create tension in priorities and approaches. Where it gets really wonky, though, is when we have incentive misalignment. And where we sort of start to try to do attribution to sort of give credit. This deal was generated by marketing, but this one was generated by sales. I think ultimately what we need to do to sort of move forward is I like to use a sports analogy. It's like look at American football or something, where you've got players in different positions. You have the linemen and you also have the running backs, and like they do very, very, very different things, and they play very different roles on the team. But ultimately, there's one scoreboard, right? There's you either score the touchdown or field goal or you don't, and you do that as a team. So I'd say, stop arguing over marketing source versus sales sourced, have an everyone sourced pipeline mindset, and that really then encourage, these different, players on the team who have different skills and different mindsets to kind of collaborate. I'll also say you asked about technology. I'm sure that partly plays a role. But as I used to write about when I was doing Engagio in the account-based marketing world, there is a fundamental disconnect that, the marketing technologies like Marketo focus on leads, whereas salespeople focus on accounts. And so that's why ABM became important, was just, well, at least let's be talking about the same object. That can also help.
It reminds me of a conversation we've had here at Asimule hundreds of times over the last 18 months or so. And that is the idea around the simple idea or concept around sales collateral, right? Where marketing's putting collateral together and spending a lot of time making it beautiful, et cetera, giving it to sales, and then sales is not using it or ignoring it. And sales saying, hey, you aren't giving me the right stuff. And there being this like disconnect. And as we started to do research uh, on this particular topic, we realized something that was so simple. Again, this wasn't rocket science, but it was that sales felt like it was too generic, right? That it wasn't based on their conversations that they were having in real time. And so I heard this over and over, a salesperson say, well, I am doing my discovery call or qualification, depending on the process. And there are these very specific points that I just pulled out from this very specific persona, stakeholder on this call. And then now I'm attaching this generic PDF that is not speaking to that, right? There might be pieces to that. And it got me thinking. It was like, wow, this is part of the what feels like disconnect, misalignment. The PDF was accurate. It just wasn't focused on the specific 3 points, let's say, that the salesperson was honing in on, right? And so, to your point, like if we could really create some sort of holistic model that incentivizes the team win, right? And I know some organizations have done this well. That seems like it'll help better. Of course, there's tools and things that can help as well. So that just came to mind around, like, both perspectives are great, and I've spent a lot of time formulating them, but but they're just the point of view, perhaps, or what's relevant in that moment. John, I wanted to ask you about the customer experience. You mentioned this at the top of the show, which was buying has changed, right? And we've heard, a lot of acronyms, even though PLG is not a new motion, right? It's been around for a very, very long time. Like, it's seemed to become a category, and there's tools and et cetera that have emerged around it. When you say buying has changed in B2B, are there any sort of things that pop up um, a little more than others, perhaps? Do you have any tips, rather, that organizations can kind of embrace to start to understand that buying has indeed changed? And one last thing I wanted to mention, we've been hearing, HubSpot talk about the impact of inbound marketing and content for a long time. It seems to certainly have accelerated in things like asynchronous buying and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about some of the big themes. One, self-service buying, the self-service trend. Gartner says 75% of buyers prefer to buy without interacting with a salesperson at all. Forrester says it's 70%. They also say that increasingly we're going to see large deals go through self-service channels. And I think as we see more millennial and Gen Z buyers, that trend's only going to continue. So I think it's important to, deliver these self-service experiences, whether it's transparent pricing, the ability to try products out before talking to sales, basically really letting the buyer have control over their buying journey. And again, that's, I think, tied to the buyer's agents that we sort of talked about, before. I think that plus sort of just the need to focus on experiences and relationships is probably the biggest factors.
Awesome. John, thank you so much. It was awesome to see you earlier this year in New York at the Audience Plus event. And I know there was some other stuff going on. Really, really appreciate it. If folks wanted to maybe learn more about you, maybe follow your content, I'm guessing LinkedIn's the best channel. I know you have a new company that you're working on here, but any other URLs or channels to reach you?
Yeah, the best way is just follow me on LinkedIn. I post, what's on my mind almost every week, and, hints about what I'm working on with my new company. So definitely Jon Miller 2 at LinkedIn is the best way to find me.